and welcome to Viewpoint on Ukraine today. The war in eastern Ukraine has been going on for nearly a year and a half. As winter approaches, a long, drawn-out standoff is on the horizon between government troops and Russian-backed militants. So are the Ukrainian troops prepared for this? And has the Ministry of Defense done enough? Joining us now is a man who's come from the front line in the east, Peter Zalmayev. He's the director of the Eurasia Democvracy Initiative. It's an organization focused on strengthening ties between post-Soviet countries in the West. Welcome to Viewpoint.
Welcome, thank you.
So what can you tell us about the situation on the ground in the east?
Well, the ceasefire has largely held over the past few months, although we have been very concerned with reports over the last few weeks and days that about the resumption of hostilities around the usual areas, around the Donetsk airport and other outlying areas. So we've seen an uptick in violence, deaths on both sides of the divide. Largely, though, there's an impression that this is becoming a frozen conflict sort of pattern on Transnistria.
This is something the Ukrainian government is trying to avoid labeling.
Yes,
as.
Keeping it, and I think the perception has been that the other side, Moscow, is actually interested in keeping it frozen, just short of a resolution, just short of an accommodation with the government in Kiev, keeping it just hot enough to be able to continue blackmailing the government in Kiev.
But is it good in the long run for Moscow? I mean, the kind of economic implications of keeping a frozen conflict just hot enough?
Well, it is a serious concern because this region, the infrastructure has been largely demolished. Much of as you know, it was a major industrial hub, powerhouse, which has now been the responsibility of Moscow, feeding the several million people who live on occupied territories. So I think part of the reason for these continuous resumptions of hostilities, these flare-ups, is to try to force the government in Kiev to assume more of an economic responsibility. For this region.
To invest more.
To invest more, to try to force Kiev to continue paying pensions to folks living on occupied territories.
It's interesting that before the interview, you told me that you heard reports of the Donetsk militant leadership starting to pay pensions to Ukrainians living on the occupied territories.
Well, yes, old folks, obviously folks relying on pensions for for their living, have relied on pensions from the government, the separatist government in Donetsk, but also from humanitarian assistance from the likes of Rinat Akhmetov, once Ukraine's richest man, and essentially the main guy in Donetsk. So there's a paradoxical situation from my conversations with folks there. I learned that some have been able to game the system, and they've been able to get both this humanitarian assistance and some financial support from the Donetsk separatist leadership, as well as a pension from Kiev.
Do you think this is good for the Ukrainian government if the Donetsk militants start paying out pensions?
Well, I think that was, the idea from the beginning, that, if you break it, you buy it. And I think, essentially, I agree with the government in Kiev that while you still have to treat these people living on those occupied territories as your own citizens, the economic burden, for as long as the situation persists and the conflict remains frozen, should fall on the sponsor of this conflict from the beginning, which is Moscow.
And you visited some of the cities, you visited several towns, and you saw what the situation was like on the ground, and we've been talking about it, a little bit about it. Can you tell us what the situation is like by the checkpoints? Because there's a lot of reports of blocked civilians and aid, and traffic is there, and conditions aren't very good. And what was your impression of checkpoints?
I think this is one of the main issues there, and you have to keep in mind that these outlying areas, their economy still largely depends on their, links with the hub, with the regional hub, with the city of Donetsk. So I heard reports of folks being stranded at these checkpoints for hours and hours and hours on end. And what really struck me is that going to Donetsk seems to be harder and seems to be fraught with more obstacles, including bribe-seeking, extortion.
From which side?
From the Ukrainian side. Then coming back from Donetsk. And then you have to keep in mind, of course, the permit, the exit permit now that folks have to apply in order to be able to travel to Donetsk, and that takes up to 10 days. That also created a sort of rent-seeking situation where local officials in charge of these permits now are in a position to extract bribes to expedite the process.
What are some of the stories that you heard from people standing in line, or perhaps who've already crossed into the east? And yourself, how did you manage to cross the checkpoint into East Ukraine? I believe it's very hard for Ukrainians and you're Ukrainian yourself to get into the occupied territory.
I just need to correct you. I went all the way up to the border of the occupied territory, and we passed a few Ukrainian checkpoints on the way, but I never crossed the actual borderline with the Donetsk People's Republic. It's simply, for me, it's not safe to do so. I've been, a public figure commenting on the situation, so I do not think it's time for me to travel there yet. So, but for folks who do that, the report is that, and the sense is that there is much humiliation that folks undergo, and I've been also told that depending on the area of Ukraine from where the folks manning the checkpoints are, that can also affect the situation. I've heard that folks from Dnipropetrovsk or Zaporozhye is one thing. Folks from Western Ukraine seem to treat people traveling in and out a little harsher. Once again, that may be just hearsay. That may also be part of the propaganda efforts on the part of the Donetsk People's Republics,
right? To kind of fuel
this sort of animosity and create this idea of Russian speakers being part of
targeted
one thing and being targeted and singled out. But I would say that at the very least there's some truth to that, and there's some concerns that have to be addressed as far as expediting the procedure and making sure there's no that the bribery and extortion do not have such a wide scale.
Right. So how would the Ukrainian government avoid kind of these situations where a lot of checkpoints have already been set up and new ones are being planned to set up in Mariupol, for example? The line of contact is being shifted a little bit. Some of the Ukrainian government-held towns will now be the neutral territory. Right. So the line will be shifting and more checkpoints will be set up. Will this cause more problems, essentially?
I think, yes. I mean, if you take a longer philosophical look at it, war is war, and these abuses will occur. But I think more attention needs to be paid to that, and it needs to receive more scrutiny, and monitors have to be dispatched and address this. I think it's not as difficult as it seems.
Now, you said that in Moscow's interest is to keep this war in the East a frozen conflict. And but Moscow has also been involved in Syria. It's begun its airstrikes. And so do you think that if potentially, now that Moscow's attention is elsewhere in Syria, for example, this is kind of the time to ease the tension in the Donbass and begin perhaps an offensive? This is a completely hypothetical situation, of course. And would the Ukrainian army potentially benefit if the Minsk ceasefire wasn't in place? Would they have benefited?
Well, I don't want to get in this business of saber rattling and advocating, a resumption of hostilities. I want the war to be over.
Of course, diplomatic efforts are the number one priority.
And I think it's first of all diplomacy and trying to re-engage with the folks living on occupied territory. Try to win the hearts and the minds there. That's going to be difficult, but you are absolutely right. I think Putin's adventure in Syria, I think that necessitated this sort of scaling back of operations operations in the east of Ukraine and Donbass, simply because the Russian army would be spread too thin for any major flare-up of hostilities, for any major territorial gains. I think this is a new spectacle that is being fed to the Russians, to the Russian population. We're now fighting against terrorists in Syria. I think this was also, apart from the attempt to distract the world's attention from the crisis in eastern Ukraine.
So the priorities have basically shifted.
They have shifted simply because it's a new spectacle. Now it's a new narrative, and I think it would be too much of a distraction and nuisance for Putin to keep two stories going at the same time. So now we moved from eastern Ukraine to Syria, where Russia is now, I think, getting bogged down with the Turkish, situation with the shooting down of the plane, etc. So whether, how the Ukrainian government will take advantage of the situation, whether it will do so by trying to, flex some muscles and resume hostilities, it's not for me to say what is the best, step in that direction. But I think that, and I'm hopeful that the situation at least will not lead to a serious,
and potentially more flare-ups and more ceasefire violations. It was a very interesting discussion today with you. Thank you for coming into our studio.
Thank you.
This has been Peter Zalmayev. He's a director of the Eurasia Democvracy Initiative. It's an organization focused on strengthening ties between post-Soviet countries in the West. You've been watching Viewpoint on Ukraine Today.